star system. Memories of scarred victims. The ones that do survive, we circle back and go and get them. Bombard from orbit with planet destroying ordnance. And everyone can get it, from leaders to their subordinates. All we need is coordinates. Millions of ships are swarming and the storm begins. Entropy waving, no time to mourn your friends. The heralds of the void, impearled of the spoiled. Leave them curdled and boiled and fertile as soil. We heathens in the name of the mothers. Be flaming the others. And pain they will suffer and leave their bodies laid in the gutter. They never recover. We swarm and move on just like the locust does. So if we think your plan is the shit, we're taking over, cuz your people are weak and you all couldn't keep it. And for the glory of the empire, we took it and reaped it as ours. Our battle cries, submit or die. They don't consider why the slightest provocation. We waiting to let them lasers fly. Some even brave to try and battle back the state of time. But die when the entropic fleet rises and starts to mobilize. An ancient race that boasts eons of steady dominance. It's no coincidence. You now witness divine providence. Spawn of the dragon. Their hopes will get destroyed and abandoned. There are no equals or no worthy combatants. We are the blood of Zolokar, the purging of all stars. We exist because the end of existence, these avatars. Your planets by the time we get finished are all charred. All the corpses that remain have the mark of a sickle scar. Star system after star system, memories of scarred victims. The ones that do survive, we circle back and go and get them. Bombard from orbit with planet destroying ordnance. And everyone can get it, from leaders to their subordinates. All we need is coordinates. Millions of ships are swarming and the storm begins. Entropy waving, no time to mourn your friends. The heralds of the void, impearled of the spoiled. Leave them curdled and boiled and fertile as soil. We heathens in the name of the mothers. Be flaming the others. And pain they will suffer and leave their bodies laid in the gutter. They never recover. We swarm and move on just like the locust does. So if we think your plan is the shit, we're taking over, cuz your people are weak and you all couldn't keep it. And for the glory of the empire, we took it and reaped it as ours. Our battle cries, submit or die. They don't consider why the slightest provocation. Your planets by the time we get finished are all charred. All the corpses that remain have the mark of a sickle scar. Star system after star system, memories of scarred victims. The ones that do survive, we circle back and go and get them. Bombard from orbit with planet destroying ordnance. And everyone can get it, from leaders to their subordinates. All we need is coordinates. Millions of ships are swarming and the storm begins. Entropy waving, no time to mourn your friends. The heralds of the void, impearled of the spoiled. Leave them curdled and boiled and fertile as soil. We heathens in the name of the mothers. Be flaming the others. And pain they will suffer and leave their bodies laid in the gutter. They never recover. We swarm and move on just like the locust does. So if we think your plan is the shit, we're taking over, cuz your people are weak and you all couldn't keep it. And for the glory of the empire, we took it and reaped it as ours. Our battle cries, submit or die. They don't consider why the slightest provocation. We waiting to let them lasers fly. Some even brave to try and battle back the state of time. But die when the entropic fleet rises and starts to mobilize. An ancient race that boasts eons of steady dominance. It's no coincidence. You now witness divine providence. Spawn of the dragon. Their hopes will get destroyed and abandoned. There are no equals or no worthy combatants. We are the blood of Zolokar, the purging of all stars. We exist because the end of existence, these avatars. Your planets by the time we get finished are all charred. All the corpses that remain have the mark of a sickle scar. Star system after star system, memories of scarred victims. The ones that do survive, we circle back and go and get them. Bombard from orbit with planet destroying ordnance. And everyone can get it, from leaders to their subordinates. All we need is coordinates. Millions of ships are swarming and the storm begins. Entropy waving, no time to mourn your friends. The heralds of the void, impearled of the spoiled. Leave them curdled and boiled and fertile as soil. We heathens in the name of the mothers. Be flaming the others. And pain they will suffer and leave their bodies laid in the gutter. They never recover. We swarm and move on just like the locust does. So if we think your plan is the shit, we're taking over, cuz your people are weak and you all couldn't keep it. And for the glory of the empire, we took it and reaped it as ours.
Cosmic Scientist, Biddy Love, what's up? What's up? Just getting started. Um, I'm gonna. I keep getting this warning that my stream's bitrate is a little bit lower than normal, and I kind of want to stop it real quick and change that. It shouldn't change the link or anything because I'm gonna do it really fast, but I don't know if I should because I keep getting this warning. But if you guys hear me, then it'll just be something that I address next time. Because every time I do a stream on OBS proper, um, I get this weird, like, I get all these weird sort of artifacts. So, hell yeah. Yeah, last week, had some audio issues with my microphone and it wasn't picking up, when I was whispering like this and stuff like that. It wasn't picking it up. So I had to adjust my audio gate and everything like that, and had to make sure that, audio gate wasn't cutting out, some of the major uh, frequencies that, you know, make my voice my voice. So hopefully that sounds good. Um, we do have other sort of news in that Lord Entropy is going to be communicating via voice chat today. Um, and so I'm going to, whenever I answer any questions, I'm going to, if he has something to say, I'm going to refer to his comments on the matter via voice recording. So if you guys have any questions directly for him, he's able to answer. He'll be in the stream today. So that's legit. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there. Cosmic Scientists, we had a great question that you posted in the OBC channel on the Majestic Comics side. If you have not joined the Majestic Comics Discord, you probably should. And there's a channel over there for OBC discussions. And so if you're interested in OBC in that way, I would definitely suggest that you head over to the Majestic Comics Discord and join in that discussion. Also, this discussion on omniversal block cosmology is brought to you by the Majestic Comics Patreon. Always going to be promoting that, as that is the main sponsor of the show. It's how you directly support us as a company, directly support me as an artist. I know a lot of people ask me what's the best way to support an artist. Honestly, subscription services. So hopefully this video will be viewed many, many times. These videos aren't designed to necessarily be viewed live, although I like doing them live, and of course we like doing them live. They're really going to be for when people want to come back and refer to conversations that we had about OBC. They'll be able to see some of these conversations develop. Don't forget to hit that like button. It would be greatly appreciated if you are able to, and if you're able to subscribe as well. So, we are obviously, going to be discussing certain elements of OBC today, but I wanted to kickstart it with Cosmic Scientist's question, which was posted in the OBC discussions channel on the Majestic Comics Discord. So he asked, can reality blocks interact like merging and passing through each other? Could it be it depends on key similarities one block shares with other blocks? So this made me want to go into a discussion about intra-block and inter-block dynamics. Now, there is somewhat of a direct answer to this question. I'm not going to go so direct. I do want to frame it with how the descriptions of intra-block and inter-block dynamics differ. So we are going to get into that. So let's kind of first, for anybody who's new watching this, omniversal block cosmology, also known as OBC, right, is a concept that introduces omni as the shorthand description of the totality of existence, or all, right? And existence is broken up into these different ontological configurations, uh, which we call blocks. So, blocks of reality have ontological values assigned to the attributes of that reality, which are decided in the meta nature sort of ordering process and the signal flow of how different ontological attributes will affect others in the meta nature definition of that reality block. And so these blocks have an intra-block nature, and then they have interblock dynamics that determine how they interact with other blocks throughout the omni, as well as their interactions of entities, constructs, or influences from other blocks. So that is very much what OBC is, somewhat of the structure of OBC, which is you have this sort of this totality term, which it encompasses all of these different realities, and then each reality has its own internal reality or intra-block dynamics, which are decided via the meta nature and the ontological values of the attributes of that meta nature and the signal flow of how that meta nature was put together and all different kinds of stuff. So that's kind of the framing of what OBC is for everyone who's kind of new. As far as the question about merging and passing through blocks, merging and passing through each other. So let's kind of get into the intra-block dynamics first, right? And the intra-block dynamics of OBC talk about the characteristics and the mechanics and the intricacies of what happens inside of a reality block. But it is a very diverse and, definitively independent definition for each block. So the way that I articulated that was each block in the omniverse is governed by its own set of physical laws, logical frameworks, and truths. This means that what is possible or true in one block can be vastly different or even impossible in another. This concept is fundamental in the nature of a diverse and multifaceted omniverse, where each block is uniquely different with its own characteristics and internal logic. Within each reality block, the fundamental nature and governing principles are determined by the order and the manner in which ontological values are assigned key attributes, right? So, or I should say, ontological attributes are assigned key values. I'll probably rewrite that. But ultimately, it still stands where you have whatever these values, and I say ontological values, things like time, space, dimension, whatever the quantum value or signature is, whatever the consciousness potentiality signature is, how the quintessence of that block is configured as well as distributed. There's a bunch of, and then, the ontological values that I have no access to because my sensory perception and language limitations prevent me from articulating or conceiving them. So there may be ontological values that I have no awareness of because I just don't have the physiological makeup to access that information. So hopefully everybody's still with me, and I'm sure everybody in the future watching this is kind of still with me. So those are some of the different values that are going to be decided, right? Polarity is going to be decided. logic and time and how they work are all going to be decided on that. So, and Tombstone, you're more than welcome to jump in whenever you want. A couple of other things as it pertains to interblock dynamics. So, or intra-block dynamics. The way that the boundaries of these blocks are decided from the inside out, basically. So these are decided and determined by the ontological attributes and however they're defined. And that kind of determines how these blocks are separated from other blocks and the bleed space in between them. So that's just briefly the intra-block dynamics. Then you get into the inter-block dynamics, right? Which talk more about interaction and influence and the ontological alignment principle that many blocks you have to essentially assume based on whatever the logic and the meta nature of a block actually is. So interblock dynamics deals with the nature of independent but not isolated. So while blocks are independent, they aren't isolated from other blocks because you have the only thing separating them is the bleed space in between them that is defined as this interstitial zone of. You said I actually thought I got stream earlier, but it was actually paused. No worries. It's the interstitial zone between these reality blocks. And the reason why we always have it depicted as a cube is because it's easy to kind of show those zones between blocks because of our perception of 3 dimensions and whatnot. But that is not an actual visual representation of the Omni. It's just because we use the term blocks. And of course, if you scale that up visually, you'd kind of get this sort of Rubik's Cube of realities that has this space in between them. But they have the ability to interact in the context of entities and constructs from within blocks that have a similar ontological alignment will have a margin of compatibility that they will fall into. And if they fall outside of that, then they don't have the ability to truly interact with that reality without some form of omni hacking. So, Tombstone, I'm assuming this is on intra-block dynamics. Let's see.
So yeah, I just wanted to give a quick layman's explanation for those who aren't caught up with some of the terminology and just really coming upon this video for the first time. So when it comes to understanding intra-block dynamics in the Omniverse, there are a few things. Uh, you have diverse and independent realities. So in the Omniverse, like each block or reality is like unique. So it's governed by its own set of rules. So what's true or possible in one reality might be completely different or impossible in another. And it's this diversity, like this is what makes the Omniverse like varied and fascinating. The other thing is like the building blocks of reality. Each reality is made up of fundamental elements, like how space, time, consciousness, other basic attributes are arranged. So these elements are put together in different ways. That is one of the other things that creates the unique nature of each reality. Um, so then you have uh, different ways of arranging that reality. So you have linear assignment, non-linear assignment, and hybrid assignment. So linear assignment is like in some realities, these fundamental elements are arranged in a specific order. For example, if consciousness is prioritized over space and time in that reality, it means that in that reality, the mind might be more powerful than the physical universe. Then non-linear assignment. So that's like in other realities, these elements might be arranged all at once or in random order, which leads to more complex and unpredictable worlds. And then finally, hybrid assignment. So many realities combine both linear and nonlinear methods. And that leads to a mix of predictable and surprising elements.
To that point, what he's describing is known as signal flow. So the signal flow of the meta nature definition, where he's talking about the order in which these values act on each other, can create wildly varied types of realities. It could be similar, but consciousness came first. So therefore, at the fundamental root level of this block, consciousness is the most powerful and has influence and can act on space time, the quantum realm, polarity, potentiality, all those different things within that block. It can act directly on quintessence, right? At the most root level, which is the potentiality that gives these reality blocks their characteristics. And then, of course, he was talking about how unique a lot of these realities would have to be in order to satisfy this variability. But yeah, great points. Definitely keep chiming in. Definitely love hearing you chime in. Much love, Majestic. Can't talk at work, but this will be in the background. Hopefully, OBC bleeds into the subconscious of those around. Much appreciated. Thank you. We hope that people are as intrigued into omniversal block cosmology as we are, because this is something that we have taken a lot of time to craft. And myself, Tombstone, there's been other writing contributors to certain concepts of OBC that this is as important to us as extropy and entropy, and as important to us as GU and the UF and everything that's within Grand Unified. This is right up there. So we love having this conversation, and we love that you guys love having this conversation with us. So, and the Gurnard, this is some great stuff, but I have to go to work. Back to the mundane. It's one thing OBC is not. It is not mundane. Don't forget to hit the like button on the way out. We appreciate it. This also is why existential tunnels are interesting, right? So, what happened in issue 0, right? Gray, Eoa Gray, asks the question of what if the reality that we knew was connected to a greater order of cosmology that has these realities interconnected in some way, some more directly connected to others, but these realities, these blocks, exist in a greater ontological configuration. And so he's asking the question from the very start. The comic book of Extropy and Entropy is really our way of telling a story about OBC. It was always designed for that. The comic book is a story medium so that we can inject certain aspects of omniversal block cosmology into it so that the story is consistent with the model. This is why you guys got to read the comic book, because in every comic, there's more development and exposition about OBC, who discovered it, who founded it, who's Ur-Mufil, who's No Tears Again, why is Gray so interested in this unification science? All that stuff, all roads point to OBC. All roads lead to OBC. And the reason why omniversal block cosmology was developed in the way that it was because we wanted Eoa Gray to have a hard line of science that he revealed to the reader over time. So it was really important to have this fleshed out in a way to where he could theoretically use this as a science. Lord Entropy's race of entropics, their power set is explained by OBC. Their, aspects about the abstract reality or the G universe that are explained by OBC. Everything in all of our stories, all of our spin-off comics, all of our other titles, whether it's a dimension away or singularity or omnithology or the G universe stories or extropy and entropy, like these are all stories that are contained within the model of omniversal block cosmology. So Tombstone says Gray's exploratory power. Yeah, it is a way for Eoa Gray to explain to the reader why the things that the reader is seeing is possible, why it makes sense in the comic book world and whatnot. So, to go back to the question of can blocks interact like merging and passing through each other? Could it be it depends on key similarities that one block shares to other blocks? So, to answer that question directly, I would say that if we're talking about intra-block dynamics, which are internal block dynamics, and that block has many realms and many areas of reality in it that could be defined as their own blocks, right? Like an internal omniversal structure that's not really omniversal. It's more multiversal because it's a part of the greater all. But if you're talking about intra-block dynamics, where there are multiple planes of reality, multiple realms of reality, yes, the thing you're talking about is called convergence, and it can happen. However, if you're talking about on the highest scale at the omni, if there are boundary definitions that are defined that prevent bleed space from imposing on these reality blocks, then these reality blocks cannot converge in any kind of way at the omni level. Because there are major consequences for convergence. If you've ever seen any comic books where convergence is explored, you deal with heavy consequences when realities are blending together or merging together. I mean, at every scale of reality, I mean, for the most part, at least in the ones that make sense to us, that would yield negative results for the constructs inside those blocks. At least for who they were, they're fundamentally changed. And who knows if that's a good thing or not. Let's see here.
So in a lot of comic books, they have these hyper intelligent characters, and they, they produce a lot of feats and create different technology and all of that. But the way it's usually addressed is very vague, right? The way they describe uh, certain aspects of their reality is very vague. Even the science that they're using, very vague. They throw a little stuff in there, but it's very vague. We kind of wanted it to be different for Gray. We wanted him to have like explanatory power, where over the course of the story and the various different arcs of the story, he learns more and more about this stuff and is able to articulate this more and more.
Damn, I didn't even realize I was muted that whole time. My bad. To his point, he's right. The explanatory power of Gray is something that made us want to separate him from all the other like comic book intellects that are out there, because it made it so that Gray had the ability to explain the things that the reader is seeing on page, and regardless of how illogical it might be or counterintuitive it might be, there's an explanation in OBC as to why it is, or why it's possible, why there's the potentiality for that to happen in that block. So hopefully I'm back. Am I back? Oh, this is like a little Dunkin's iced tea or whatever. It's like a strawberry iced tea or something. I don't know. It had caffeine in it, and I needed some caffeine this morning. So, but yes, I love that explanation because it's very accurate. We needed Gray to be able to explain the things that are happening in the comic, based on they're like an actual model that has some internal logic to it. Because the thing about a lot of these realities, and there's some out there that have, like, I just saw Dune the other day, and good Lord, I mean, I don't even want to deviate from the conversation, but that's the best movie I've seen probably since The Matrix, and it is visually it's better than The Matrix. I mean, and I remember how I felt when I saw The Matrix, but the first Dune, the one that came out in 2021, that, man, that is the most epic visually. It's like Star Wars and Game of Thrones had a baby on a good budget and a good director. like absolute lunacy, the scale of that movie and the score. Hans Zimmer. Is Hans Zimmer the GOAT? Is he truly the GOAT? Is John Williams not the actual Billy Goat? Is Alan Silvestri not the actual Billy Goat? Is it Hans? Because it might be him. So anyway, Dune was amazing. But the idea of having a model that explains the Dune reality, or the extropy and entropy reality, our reality. That's the beauty of OBC. That's what makes it so valuable and such a great narrative tool, because it allows you to explain through the science of the meta nature that's been defined in the block why things make sense and why they are the way that they are. So, in that, your answer for can reality blocks converge internally, in where blocks have multi realms defined, sure. I mean, I think that it probably can happen in some and can happen in others, but at the greatest scale of the Omni, where these massive reality blocks have boundaries from other massive reality blocks, there are some realities that simply cannot converge because of their ontological, their inability to be ontologically aligned in any kind of way. And there's just so many of these blocks out there, a greater than absolute infinite amount of blocks out there that cannot ontologically mix with each other. Just can't at that scale, at that level. What other questions we got for interblock and intrablock dynamics? Yeah, I'm a big strawberry tea or strawberry lemonade, or anything like that. Angry Orphan, what's up? What's up? How you doing? And then you think about how a lot of this stuff uh, is going to be configured, and the order it will be configured in, the order in which these attributes will act upon each other. And that's going to give you a lot of these realms that you have sorcery and magic and, mysticism and stuff like that, alchemy in those realities. Not that alchemy isn't technically real, but, you know, the sort of mystical sorts of realities where you're dealing with incantations and, you know, spell casting and, that sort of stuff. Because in the meta nature of a reality, you're going to define the truths and the falses, or the logic and illogic of that reality block. So let's say the quintessence of that block has a configuration that has the ability to create a massive amount of magical and mystical potential. And then the order of the ontological values are set in a way to where that reality block allows for great sorcery, great magic. Truth zero was defined there as, vocal incantations of a similar frequency can cause the quintessence to collapse into a state of true potentiality that gives that person whatever powers you want. I mean, you really can use OBC to define and describe and explain anything in any block anywhere in the omniverse. Could any interactions leave traces in a way? I would argue at the omniversal scale, all interactions are going to leave some sort of a trace, because you're doing something at such an existential scale, so high on the ontological totem pole, that it will most likely affect. There will be incidents that send ripples throughout the omni. I think there are incidents in nature, not in nature, but in the all, that would send ripples through the all. So there are going to be stories where, you don't know how this is going to affect the greater omni. You just know that it's going to affect the greater omni. So if you come from a reality where, you not even getting into the margin of error or the margin of compatibility, like you could theoretically go to a reality from a reality where you simply being in that reality has consequences for that block or consequences for that reality. That is very much something that is likely, most likely. What else we got? I can answer OBC questions all day. So if you guys do want to leave, a vocal chat in the OBC section, obviously regarding OBC, just make sure there's not any background noise or anything like that when you're talking. But I will play it on the stream, and I will try to answer your question as best as I can. So when I finally go to a Star Trek convention, I'm going as Martok. You're amazing. The most amazing. All right, what other questions we got? What's funny is I like to ask questions of Chat GPT and other AI about OBC, because you can upload documents and make it so that they can know about the data and then ask them questions about it. And you'd be surprised, like, the way that if you tell Chat GPT, hey, make this 100% consistent with OBC, and it does, it's pretty fucking amazing. The results you get from it. So yeah, I mean, ontological signal flow. The articulated application of a block's ontological definitions, which in turn defines its nature. The generalized process of signal flow in OBC involves the interaction and influence of ontological attributes in a way that can be either sequential, nonlinear, or entirely abstract, depending on the configuration of the reality block's quintessence. How's that sound? Just made that up. Captain Hayes, what's up, brother? You know what I'm doing, dog. I'll give you 2 guesses, but you'll only need 1. I think it's time for Big Norch, and then we could talk more OBC. Aster? Not Aster? Master. Not Aster. Master blueprint. Okay. Hell yeah, dog. Do I even need to have... I mean, you can definitely throw some of those majestic emojis. We definitely need those in the... I didn't realize that those were separated and that we had to bring those in. That smells good. Another thing that's interesting about OBC is that I didn't think I was going to be talking about meta nature so much, but meta nature is essentially the application of defining meta nature is in the ontological configuration that the potentiality of the quintessence configuration allows for in that block. Does that make sense? So you get the value definition of the ontology, right? Which is, all those different values, space, time, logic, truth zero, all those different things, all that stuff. And then the signal flow of attribute influence application. So in what order do these ontological values act on each other? You could have a reality, 2 realities, where they have the same ontological value definitions, but the signal flow is different. So you have it to where in one reality, time is the same, space is the same, logic is the same, except for, and I say logic is the same and then qualify it that it isn't, the order in which they act upon each other is different. So maybe instead of space and time coming at the same time, maybe time comes before space, and the definition of time affects the ultimate definition of space. Instead of space and time, let's say, affecting the definition of consciousness. Or if consciousness comes first, affecting the definition of space and or time. Does that make sense? Or am I just getting way too high? For all the people in the future, where I'm long gone and everybody is long gone, these are the conversations that we would have with the internet, right? Like, it's crazy higher order conversations that probably have no bearing in actual reality, but it's so fun. Yeah, you definitely need Nitro to use crossover emojis, but I think you can upload emojis onto the server you want, so that should work. Hey, Cosmic Scientist, if you're still there, let me know if I answered your question, because, may not have directly, but hopefully I did. So then you get into the question of how you get your fundamental forces, which the answer is in the definition of the nature of the reality block. Fundamental forces emerge as an intra-block consequence in the makeup of ontological configuration. How many and what they do are a result of how those initial ontological attributes are defined and in which order they are designed in, and as well, or I should say defined in, not designed in. Or they could be designed to, but defined is a type of design, I guess. In as well as the order they are meant to act upon each other. So that's how you get your fundamental forces internally for each block. And then those fundamental forces, however they are defined, will then sort of be the lower gods of that reality governing most interactions. Permutations and combinations in metanature. The greater than absolute infinity of possible signal flow and ontological configurations and influence patterns contribute to the incomprehensible diversity of reality blocks within the omniverse. Each unique signal flow creates a distinct ontological framework for its block. That basically is what I described, although that was kind of a run-on sentence, that first sentence. But it's interesting that I tend to articulate this when I'm dealing with numbers and values that are above infinite, but obviously not omni, because the only value for omni is omni, right? It's more of a description of all than a value of quantity. But there is a quantifiable number in the omni. It's just not definable or articulatable by constructs from inside blocks. I don't even think Ascends or Multi Eternals have the vocabulary to articulate omni. In fact, they can't. It would basically invalidate the idea of the proto disqualifier. What else we got? But that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. The signal flow itself, the signal flow of ontological attributes. The signal flow itself is a meta attribute of the block, influencing how other attributes interact and evolve within the reality. It shapes the block's potential for change, stability, and interaction internally, as well as how compatible it is with other blocks, meaning how compatible constructs from inside that block will be inside other blocks with other ontological definitions. If the definitions are similar and have, similar, like a truth and false overlap, then yeah, it's most likely you can, as a construct of the reality you're leaving, survive in the reality of destination. But there are realities out there that are completely incompatible, and their truth and false definitions basically state that unless you omni hack your way into surviving that reality, you are in no way, shape, or form compatible and will die upon or not be die. You'll essentially have your quintessence, redistributed among the Omni, which is probably the worst type of, I guess, end, if you could call it such a thing. But yeah, basically, there are realities that are completely incompatible with each other. Causality is another one of those attributes. Cosmic Scientist asks, could a general AI be influenced or even enhanced by another more advanced AI from a compatible block? This is interesting because this gets into technological and magical compatibility across blocks. This is a fascinating question, and I love this question because this speaks to the diversity of meta nature definition and how distinct each block of reality can be. So let's just start by saying that every block is going to define its meta nature differently because the likelihood of there being a completely identical block, and it's out there because there is a greater than 0% chance that that can happen. But the fact that you're talking about ontological values that are defined in such a way to where the likelihood of you finding a completely identical ontological value signature with another block is so incomprehensibly small, but it is greater than 0, right? So as the smallest value you can conceive of that's greater than 0, that also puts that number at infinite, because since the Omni has a greater than absolute infinite amount of space and essentially no time, that you'll find a infinite amount of those realities with identical signatures. But there are realities where magic and technology are compatible because of that. Because there are realities where the ontological values are either identical or very similar in a way where there's not that much consequence in the margin of compatibility. But there are going to be realities where this technology is technology, that reality's technology is technology, but the technologies are fundamentally incompatible because of the logic of the reality in which they were governed by is incompatible with the logic of the reality that they now either reside in or they're trying to function in. So AI could be compatible or influential to other AIs and other blocks if it was so compatible. But that's not a guarantee. Compatibility, just because it's technology, doesn't mean it's the same technology. If you're in a 2D reality and I'm coming from a 3D reality and I happen to survive the trip from my reality to your reality, what makes me think any of my 3D technology or understanding of technology from a 3D perspective is going to be compatible in your 2D reality block, or vice versa? If you happen to survive the transition from 2D to 3D, what likelihood is it that you are going to survive my 3-dimensional perspective of time, space, and technology? Hopefully that answers your question. What else we got? This is fun. And OBC can't answer everything. In fact, it articulates that it can't answer everything because constructs from inside the block can't describe the block in its totality. What OBC is a shadow of the theory of everything that it is attempting to be, simply acknowledging its limitations in perception and articulation in the process. I got Norch, but I don't got Bowl. Let me go grab Bowl.
Our battle cries submit or die. They don't consider why the slightest provocation we waiting to let them lasers fly. Some even brave to try and battle back the state of time, but die when the entropic fleet rises and starts to mobilize. An ancient race that boasts eons of steady dominance. It's no coincidence you now witness divine providence. Spawn of the dragon, their hopes will get destroyed and abandoned. There are no equals or no worthy combatants. We are the blood of Zola.
All right, cool. And yes, the music's supposed to be low. I just wanted it up because I needed something in the background to pack my bowlage. Heathens in the name of the mothers be flaming the others. Leave the bodies laid in the gutter, they never recover. Just like the locust does. We taking over, cuz. Took it and reaped it as ours. What else we got? You know I'm itching for those OBC questions, y'all. I'm always like, if you ask anybody who hangs out with me at all, it's like the one thing that I can't stop talking about. I just have to like literally just close my mouth because I can't not talk about it. OBC so expansive, you can literally never run out of material in multiple lifespans. I agree with that, actually. You know, Tombstone calls it the greatest prop device or the greatest plot device ever conceived. And I have a hard time disagreeing with him. I really do. I feel like, man, just really allows you to play in the weeds of philosophy and ontology and kind of allow such a varied, unique way of looking at reality blocks by not having a static view of reality. That's the thing about OBC that really makes me excited, is that every moment I think about it, I think of a new reality type. I think of a new ontological configuration and order that yields fundamental forces, that yields the dynamics of a reality that we would call fiction, we would call illogical or fake or unreal. When in this reality, from another reality's logic and ontological value definition, this reality is fake. You mean a reality where light only travels 186,000 miles per second in a vacuum? You know what I mean? Like, that is fiction to another reality block. But here in this reality block, it's absolute law that information can travel as fast as light, and that's it, at least to what we know of, you know, general relativity and blah, blah, blah. So to me, it's OBC is that plot device that allows you to have these sort of conversations and feel like you're actually having a conversation that is existential and ontological. Let's see. 1 hour in, I can do my cheap plug of a commercial. All right. So this OBC discussion is brought to you by the Majestic Comics Patreon. Please support. It helps. Every little bit helps. And we greatly appreciate all of the people who continue to support us on our Patreon. So thank you very much. And back to your regularly scheduled OBC program. What other questions we got? I'm actually also going to step out real quick, and I will be back in a hot second. I'm actually going to play some, let's see, I only need like 30 seconds, so.
On one side, you have an ancient warrior race of beings that represent entropy, and on the other side, you have an advanced race of beings that represent extropy. You know, sooner or later, these forces will collide. For thousands of years, we suffered no peers, equals and rivals, none of them can survive around here. We bathed in the blood of enemies that threaten with malice, impaled the heads of kings on spikes outside of their palace. Three entire civilizations, we made them extinct, for trying to circumvent the balance, they were gone in the blink. A bona fide galaxy buster, the Reba Armada. So any nation breaking the rules, that we come in to stomp, yeah. We are legion, manifestations of purest entropy, entropic empire, annihilating infinity. We are not deaf and know those rumors persist. We are the things that make it possible for death to exist. These lower species of specks that we're not bound to respect. We hardly notice them, even with our boots on their neck. The warrior class, we are the standard, the epitome, the masters of the massacre, loyal to Lord Entropy. Two empires of polar opposite sides, inevitability that a conflict arise. The deadliest armada determine who survives. When worlds collide, there are two empires of polar opposite sides. Inevitability that a conflict arise. The deadliest armada determine who survives. When worlds collide.
Type 2.7 and ascending. My race crosses light years like they're inches. It's quite weird. With our gear, we put fear in the abstract. Superior tech, only adhere to the math facts. Past that, we're masters of quadrivium. Exponential growth in the interim. Few can match that. Imperium for nearly a millennium. Peaceful race, but won't give in to anyone. No. The upper echelon who bonds with the lexicon. Experts in quintessence, assumptions of us are extra wrong. The ultimate expression of intelligence. If we can't learn from it, it's irrelevant. People of the measurement, mentor of the species that are lesser than. In a thinking war, we expect to win. We personify extropy. Gray of extropia will modify destiny without the fly weaponry.
Two empires of polar opposite sides. Inevitability that a conflict arise. The deadliest armada determine who survives. When worlds collide, there are two empires of polar opposite sides. Inevitability that a conflict arise. The deadliest armada determine who survives. When worlds collide.
Such a dope ass beat. I love that song too. Damn, I just read something that I need to go in there and articulate better, but it was pretty fascinating about how quintessence articulates time. I was looking at the section on gods and deities and how they are defined, or at least they are allowed to be defined in the Omni. And it brings me to this section where it talks about the existential blind spots. And I remember writing this. I said, very few gods of reality blocks are aware of the greater Omni. From their perspective, inside their block of existence, they have always been and will always be. That plays on the fact that they aren't actually eternal. They are either manipulating or experiencing the sort of true nature of reality, which is at the Omni scale, all time is the same time. And so this sort of idea that like all moments exist in a state of now is how those apex entities usually manipulate their reality, or into thinking that they are eternal, when they are simply omni hacking time from their perspective inside their block. So it's like they're building reality of their block around the logic of omniversal time that only applies to them. But theoretically, they could incorporate omniversal time in their block. They just choose not to, because linear beings perceive you as eternal, and they want to be perceived as eternal. But as I've said before, there are not, nor will there ever be a apex of Omni within OBC. Just doesn't allow it. They unlock the blocks dev mode. Yeah, I've always felt like they're, with something like this, there's like a debug menu for blocks. And if you're an, one thing I love about OBC is that apex entities aren't prohibited. But what's also not prohibited is that beings who don't start off as apex entities can become apex entities. For instance, if you're a sorcerer and the reality block's ontological configuration has produced truth and false definitions that allow for an entity that is not an apex entity to become that block's apex entity, and that sorcerer exploits that by finding the right spell or the right incantation or whatever, the right relic or artifact that allows for that to be, then that sorcerer can theoretically become the apex entity of its reality block. You don't need to be instantiated as that reality block's apex entity. And there are apex entities that are vulnerable from constructs from within their own creation because of the nature, the nature of how the meta nature was defined. What else we got? And that wasn't even a question. That was just me answering, or me talking about the concept of apex entities. We have talked about multi-eternals before. I've only written a couple stories dealing with multi-eternals so far, but they are fascinating beings in comparison to the insignificant specks of nothing that apex entities are compared to them. The thing that I find fascinating about the difference between AEs and MEs, apex entities and multi-eternals, is that AEs tend to be far more arrogant about their place in the ontological stack. Because they have an internal perspective of dominion, they don't understand that externally they are a small fish in a large ocean of potentiality. And when they venture out into those waters, you know, you get bleed space entities that like, oh, here's a young god. Here's a young deity that's venturing out, you know, away from the pride. And I'm going to pick him off or her off or it off. And so a lot of gods, apex entities, avoid the deep waters of, you know, of the Omni, which is what their sort of existential blind spot, be it by choice or by circumstance, is where that comes from. Jesus, I don't even want to get into null. Anybody want to have a Nullian conversation? Then you get into obviously ascends. You know, these are entities that I feel like they are multi-eternals that have transcended even that of a multi-eternal. And that comes with as close to awareness of Omni as a multi-eternal's quintessence configuration will allow it to perceive of. But at that scale, they essentially have a level of understanding of Omni that while it doesn't protect them from bleed space entities, a bleed space entity is not just going to mollywop an ascend or a descend. It's not an easy meal. It's not an easy snack. That is a fight. That is going to be a fight, and you don't know if the ascend is going to come out of that. You don't know who's going over. Let's just put it that way. I'd say bleed space entities and ascends or descends are very close in ontological power and their ability to consume one another. Although I don't know if I've ever written a story about an ascend consuming a bleed space entity, I think it's possible. I just realized how I'm going to define the awareness of walls, fourth wall through seventh wall awareness, based on what I just defined with the ascends. So that's interesting. Every block within the Omni has an inherent consciousness potentiality value, directly correlated to its quintessence configuration. This potentiality exists regardless of whether consciousness has manifested in that reality block or not. So you could theoretically get the potential for consciousness that never manifests. Is null undefined? How does it relate to OBC? No, null is defined, but it's a proto definition. So before we go into null, we have to talk about proto, right? And we use proto, right? Like we kind of use proto for prototype, right? Which is a base model not representing the actual real thing, right? So we took the root of that and we made proto into an omniscale prefix disclaimer, I guess. What it means is you put it before something like null or omni, and you say we're having a proto null or a proto omni or a proto meta nature discussion, because you have to, from the onset, articulate the disclaimer that what you are talking about cannot be articulated in totality with the limits of your language and perception. And you have to say that on the onset. We're having a proto-null conversation. This is a proto-omni conversation. Even OBC is a proto-model of what the actual omni is. So you got to bake that into the cake. There's no version where you can't bake that into the cake. You have to bake that directly into the cake. There's no getting around that. So when you go into null, then you can have the conversation of what null actually is. So null, or non-existence, at the omni scale has to be defined because there are blocks of void which have still a quintessence configuration and thus the potentiality for something to happen even if nothing does. So we got to get that out of the way. There's an intra-block definition for nothingness, and then there's an omniscale definition for non-existence, things that can't even happen in all. So null, to Captain Hayes' question, is the conceptual and existential absence of omni itself. An anti-state where neither matter, energy, time, dimension, or even quintessence exists. Not even the potentiality for something to happen exists. It is null. And I know the word null, like the word proto and a couple other words that we have sort of repurposed for the model, has definitions in other places, specifically, math and computer programming and stuff like that. But, for OBC, we needed another word that wasn't void, that wasn't nothingness, that wasn't empty, that wasn't, any of these words that don't actually mean non-existence. We needed a short word for non-existence, which null became. But the concept of null can only be articulated from a proto perspective because there is no real access to nothingness from somethingness, not even through imagination. There's no way to get from there to here because there is no there. You can't traverse it, you can't imagine it, you can't perceive it, you can't even, the closest you can do is articulate the fact that what you're describing is a shadow of what you're actually trying to describe. And so null is the concept of the absence of omni, the absence of all. It is the anti-answer to why is there something rather than nothing? Well, if there was nothing rather than something, omni would not exist. Because if there is something, there's an all of it. Maybe that's the paradox of reality, that there actually isn't an all of reality, but that's a whole nother philosophical conversation. But at least in OBC, all exists because something exists. We just say that at the grandest scale, that something is omni, which is the container for everything else. Not necessarily, because again, with proto baked in, you're not trying to describe actual nothingness. You're not trying to describe actual null. You're saying in the description of null, I can't actually articulate it in its totality. So the fact that I'm trying to use quote unquote something to explain nothing is not actually the exercise that I'm undertaking. The exercise that I'm undertaking philosophically is to articulate the incomprehensible in a way that does justice to the fact that it's incomprehensible, but also that there's something here trying to articulate it. I think null is actually one of the hardest aspects of OBC. It is one of the most difficult aspects to understand because there is a counterintuitive understanding you have to have with when you're trying to understand its relation to the omni. Because if I'm trying to articulate it in a very simple way, I would say that everything that isn't omni is null. So if it's not within all and omni is true all, then by definition it doesn't exist. At the greatest scale of reality, it doesn't exist. And what that is, whatever we're describing, that whole greatest scale of reality not existing, that word is null. That's the word that I'm using for null. Cosmic Scientist says, the story of Sun Wukong is a good example of becoming an apex entity level status, as he's also said to have gained ridiculous amount of transcending boons. Interesting. I don't know who Sun Wukong is, but I would suspect that throughout the Omni, there have been instances where corporeal beings become apex entities. Even if it was a reality authored by finite entities. I can hear you thinking, Captain Hayes. What are you thinking? It's funny because I came back to the proto section and I said by using the proto prefix, one is essentially admitting, quote, I acknowledge that I cannot fully articulate, describe, or conceive of this concept in its true totality due to the limitations inherent to my reality block. However, I will provide a concise, thorough, and minimally viable articulation of the concept with the understanding that it absolutely falls short of the complete truth. So, proto is a lot that proto is doing. It's it's holding up a lot of weight. It's doing a lot of the lifting, the heavy lifting for how you can even have a conversation about null. And I remember writing that, and I was looking for it as we were talking about it, and I couldn't find it initially because I thought it was in another section. I thought it was in the language and perception, which proto will probably be moved to language and perception limitations, because I feel like that's a whole section in language and limitations about how you can and can't talk about OBC. Hay says, thinking about it in a mathematical way for some reason. Well, if I was to try to give a mathematical example, it would be very similar to the value of, it would be very similar to zero, or the definition of zero, which is not a value in and of itself, but a representation of the absence of value. But it's still something that is meant to articulate that there is nothing there. So zero is a type of null, but because there are beings of consciousness able to consider it, I don't think it's the true null. I think true null at an omniversal scale, and that means that in no reality below it is that possible. I don't think true null is possible in the omni. I think the omni always exists. It has always existed and will always exist, and thus there's never been a time where it didn't exist. Thus, there's never been a time where null has been true. I mean, there may be some sort of a mathematical inconsistency with the logic of dividing zero, because you're articulating in the statement that you're trying to divide something that is supposed to represent the absence of value. So if there's no values to divide, then is that an illogical mathematical expression? And the block that you're in may allow for that illogic to be true. So, truth zero could state, in this reality, dividing by zero gives you a result. And it's like, well, no matter what, reality, in this block states that if you divide by zero, it will give you a value of something. No matter what, that's truth zero. Now, I wouldn't waste my truth zero if I was an apex entity on that, but hey, you do you. Yeah, I love this right here. I didn't even realize I had the examples in here, but I said, when having a proto-omni conversation, and then I put the example in there. It says, we're having a proto-omni conversation about the scale and complexity of all. And the explanation states that this phrase indicates that the conversation touches upon the vastness and intricacy of the omni, but with the understanding that the discussion can only provide a rough approximation and never a complete or accurate depiction. And it's like, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I want the limitations of perception and language to be articulated in the model. Because I want, from Gray's perspective, from Iowa Gray's perspective, for him to be able to articulate the truth of his reality in the way that I'm able to articulate the truth of my reality through OBC. That's the goal. Just added another ontological value. Did not even think of that, but that probably should be there. That could probably go there too. So, yeah, I can't wait to reorder some of the sections here and place some of the sections in other sections because they essentially are. Having my mutes tied together is pretty good. I will say that. What else we got? Any other questions? I got like maybe 20 minutes left before I gotta skittle on daddle to record some more stuff for the album. Gotta figure out a couple of things with that. What are bleed space entities? So BSEs. They have AEs, MEs, and BSEs. And a bleed space entity is a consciousness or a creature or an entity from bleed space, native to bleed space, born of bleed space. And to understand what a bleed space entity is, you probably would want to look into the nature of bleed space itself. And of course, if these different realities have blocks where the laws, the nature is defined through the combinatory elements of the meta nature, well, this is a realm, an interstitial realm, where that is in flux and suggestive. There are no hard rules about what can and can't be and for how long and what effect they may have on other beings in that realm. And I would argue that if you are an entity with access to bleed space in some way, and you want to make an example out of an apex entity that has created a hell, you send them to bleed space. That is as close to true hell, or I guess true heaven, depending on what happens or what doesn't happen. Bleed space is inherently illogical and incomprehensible this side of null. It has very little quintessence, if, you know, it does have quintessence, just in very much smaller concentrations and distributions. And so that makes up for entities that, you know, ultimately will, that quintessence will coagulate into consciousnesses and entities that have the logic and nature and motivation of bleed space. And sometimes that means for no reason at all, it does, you know? And so you have these reality blocks that have borders based on their ontological values. And what they have borders for is not because one block is connected to the next block directly. So you go through the border and you're in. No, that's not how it works. There is a space in between reality blocks. We call it bleed space. You can call it whatever you want. In bleed space, there are entities, and those entities, their primary diet are AEs and MEs. So apex entities have no chance against BSEs. No chance. Multi-Eternals have a fight on their hands and will most likely be consumed. Multi-Eternals are very humble when it comes to bleed space. So you're dealing with entities that eat gods regularly. Dune Part 2 watch party tonight. Can't wait for that. I've been looking forward to that. I'm actually going to get some popcorn and some movie style snacks, and I'm going to watch Dune 2, dog. What would you describe Azathoth or Cthulhu in OBC? Now, that would be more of a question for people who are more well versed in Lovecraftian lore than I am, because I am not as familiar as some. And if anybody wants to chime in the OBC conversations as far as their interpretation of that, they're more than welcome to. However, I will try to define what I know of a being like Cthulhu and a being like Azathoth in OBC. So I do think that Lovecraft and Lovecraftian entities that are quote unquote beyond comprehension of corporeal and mortal mind, things that are scary because they are beyond comprehension, I think that's rooted a lot in bleed space. And I think there are a lot of entities that would be described as Lovecraftian horror in bleed space. But I also think there are entities that would make Lovecraftian horrors tuck tail and run because of the nature of bleed space and how ultimately there's really no, upper scaling limit for unless you are in Ascend and you just have that level of omniversal awareness that's, pretty vast, not absolute, but that the most vast understanding of Omni that exists in the Omni, then yeah, you're going to have your hands tied with a bleed space entity. And they don't have to have a reason at all for being. They don't have to have a reason at all for doing. Their reasoning could contradict itself one moment and not contradict itself the next. Logic and reasoning and, understanding as to why things are happening with bleed space doesn't really exist in the traditional intuitive way that we understand it. So, Azathoth and Cthulhu, I would define as something like Cthulhu being an entity, a construct within the block, who is a very powerful monster, but, you know, he's a construct of a block. Whereas, you know, you're dealing with maker gods, right? These sort of entities that are, you know, instantiated as the origin of their reality block through whatever truth definition that exists. And so has complete dominion over the eventuality of that block. So if Azathoth is this being that's, let's say, I think that's the sleeping entity, right? And he is dreaming of a reality that it happens to be that block's reality. And if he wakes up, that block is then reinitialized into its original state of just being Azathoth. Then I think that Azathoth is an internal meta nature, or a meta nature result of the ontological configurations of attributes. And he is an entity that is not a bleed space entity, but more of an apex entity or a multi-eternal. I would argue that Azathoth would fall into the multi-eternal. However, I could understand a classification of AE, and I could understand the classification of a bleed space entity. But I would classify Azathoth somewhere between AE and ME. In fact, if you want to use the term lower gods or outer gods, I would use that term as well. The lower gods, because I don't think apex entities are even close to the lower gods, and the upper gods would be multi-eternals. So if you were to classify it that way, then he would be a lower god or an outer god. Azathoth would be. That would be my OBC interpretation of Lovecraftian's Azathoth. Would I class him above, let's say, a Yahweh, or let's say, you know, another creator god? I mean, yeah, I think Azathoth could be classed higher. Pretty sure there are interpretations, but again, it all depends on your interpretation of OBC. There are certain things that are definitively defined, but there's a lot of stuff left up to interpretation of how you are going to define a reality's nature through its permutation of those values. So I think that is important. Yep, and there always is a bigger fish. Final questions, last questions. I do like that question though. I like talking Lovecraft, and even though I don't know very much about that reality's rules and, you know, anything like that, I think if you're able to define its ontological values, you can kind of understand why that reality is the way that it is. Can a bleed space entity enter a block? Yes, they can. Now, in most situations, they don't and they can't, but there are instances in which they do, whether it be through the negligence of an apex entity's boundary definitions. So apex entities are incredibly arrogant beings. They are probably the most arrogant of the above, you know, God tier class of entities, right? I mean, you're talking about the beings that lead up to apex entities, right? You have demigods or angels and demons, however you want to call them, agents of the host, right? I've heard that description, is what angels are, right? You have elementals, beings that are elemental representations or personifications of natures, right? Fire gods and water gods and stuff like that. And you get abstracts, which are, personifications of, let's say, time or space or, things like that. And then you get to the apex entities, where you have your little g gods or even maybe a big G god. But again, because there's no resistance to will, the arrogance of understanding increases because it's not tempered by the resistance in its sort of application of its will. And so, apex entities can be incredibly reckless with how they define their block borders. And they may leave some sort of a weakness where a bleed space entity is like, oh, this is nice little back door I found into your block. And then it will proceed to consume that apex entity in front of its creation. So, and then there are bleed space entities that probably, want to enter into certain blocks, but can't. But I would think that there's a greater than 0% chance that it happens. And so there's probably a bunch of instances where it happens. Greater than 0, but smaller than absolutely infinite would be the range I would give that. Any other questions? Damn, this was fun. Like I said, I could talk about OBC all day. I probably do talk about OBC all day. Having this time where I can just talk about it and nothing else is really good for my mental health, because shit is all consuming. OBC really is all consuming, and you can mess around and think about have it consume your thoughts in a way that is truly unhealthy. It is a type of philosophical drug that I didn't know you could get addicted to. So you have to really be careful getting lost into the seas, going out into the deep waters of the seas of OBC, because sometimes the waves get crazy and you don't even know where you are anymore. You're just like, listen, I don't even know what's real and what's not. Am I in a block? Am I in a nested block? Am I the apex entity? What the hell's going on here? So, don't forget, if you're watching this, please subscribe to the patreon.com/Majestic Comics page. Follow us on all of our social media as Majestic Comics. You can join our Grand Unified Discord as well as our Majestic Comics Discord. And shout out to Tombstone the Dead Man, who was here a little bit earlier, jumping in on the conversation and contributing. He's also a co-author of Omniversal Block Cosmology, so I definitely want to give him a lot of respect. And thank you to all the people who do subscribe to our Patreon. I may do something where we have like the credits, and people who subscribe will kind of roll in the credits. I think that'd be really cool. So, but yeah, I think this is again another conversation. You could talk about OBC forever, right? We literally would never have shit to run out of. I mean, things like dream and imagination, fractals, omniversal impossibilities, ethical and diplomatic complexities, quantum mechanics, the truth paradox. We've never really talked about OBCTP, and it is one of the cornerstones of OBC. The truth paradox is an amazing, we could have a 2-hour conversation just on the truth paradox. Like, we think it's hard describing things that are indescribable. What about describing things that are both true and false at the same time? And being logically consistent in that. Right? Like, there may be instances through linear logic this cannot be, but through some sort of non-linear abstract logic, it simply is. And that was defined in its sort of meta nature definition. So from us as in a block where, you know, linearity has defined our logic, then you kind of deal with this sort of abstract way of viewing that, and it's also true. Right? Like, it's there. The thing about OBC is that all realities are equally true and false simultaneously. Bake that shit. That's what makes this so intriguing and, you know, fun to play with, because things like that is what makes this so fascinating, in that these values, these attributes of ontology can be defined in such a way where their 1 + 1 = 2 is not our 1 + 1 = 2. Those twos are not the same twos. So, yeah, that level of mind fuckery is definitely coming. And I absolutely appreciate you guys indulging me as I go into my older years, and the things that I try to, I don't know, leave the world are things like this that you can play in forever. Hopefully we can handle the truth paradox. I think we can. I don't think it's beyond our limits of imagination. I don't think so. So, I will see you all in the Discord. Thank you so much to everybody who's hung out. Next week, we'll be back for another OBC conversation. So, this will just be where and when we actually do this. It will most likely be on Thursdays, and it will most likely be about 2 hours. So, hopefully everybody's doing well out there. I will see you on social media. Peace, peace.